Hi guys, Dave Patterson with the Fitlock Guild once again. This is the last day of July 2025, July 31st, July 31st. And what we're going to talk about today are 5 spiritual principles that we were taught growing up that simply aren't true. Sometimes there was no fault of those who were teaching us. They just were ignorant of the facts many times. Some of them had not been taught properly. But in any event, these 5 things were taught to us in our youth as spiritual principles, but they just aren't true. Number 1, we are all God's children. Now, most of us have heard that since we were small, but it simply isn't true. We are all God's creation, but we are not all God's children. John, the very first chapter in John, verses 12 and 13 says, "But as many as received him, he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, not of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." The scriptures are clear. In order to be part of God's family, you have to be born again. You have to accept the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as your only way to heaven, as your only way to salvation. And once you do that in earnest and in truth, you become a child of God. You become grafted in to the family of God. But make no mistake, all human beings are not children of God. We are not all God's children. We are all God's creation. But you must be born again to be a child of God and grafted into the family. That's the first misconception. The second of these 5 principles is a little bit tricky. You hear people say, and have heard people say throughout your lifetime, that God will never put more on you than you can bear. That's not necessarily true either. This is what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. It says, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you are able to bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it." So now let's unpack that a little bit, because it does say that he will not allow you to be tempted above what you can bear. But what it does not say is that your ability to extricate yourself from these situations is something you can do on your own. It does not say that. It says when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Think of it this way. If you never endured circumstances that you couldn't get yourself out of, that you couldn't find the exit ramp, so to speak, how would you ever know that God was sufficient to do what you couldn't? So that's the second of these 5 quote-unquote spiritual principles that were taught to us in our youth that simply aren't true. You will be tempted above what you were able, but God will provide a way out. You will not be able to do that. The third and fourth of these supposed spiritual principles that we were taught kind of go hand in hand. And even if you weren't told these things explicitly, you were probably made aware of them through the way that it was presented to you, and that it was insinuated that these things were true, even if they weren't explicitly said. Most of us got the message. And that message was that poverty is piousness or holiness, and wealth is wicked. Well, the Bible neither condemns material wealth, nor does it glorify material poverty. The question is not whether or not you possess considerable resources. It's whether or not those resources possess you. And that's really what it comes down to. It's a matter of the heart. And that is critical, because that's the one thing mankind cannot do on a linear basis. I can no more understand or predict what's in your heart than you can predict what's in my heart. Only God has the ability to do that. And so the idea that being poor makes you more holy, or that having wealth makes you wicked, is just not scriptural. Think of it like this. David, Solomon, Abraham, Job, all of these men were very wealthy individuals. And despite all of their human inadequacies, despite all of their failures and their impurities, were they not all considered men of God? Sure they were. They weren't considered less men of God because they had resources. But again, God no more elevates material poverty than he does demean having material resources. So those two things are not biblical principles. They are things that we are taught that just simply weren't true. And again, we can chalk that up to those that were teaching us at that time may not have been as learned as they should have been. And you can't teach what you don't know. So a lot of this was not malicious. It's just they didn't know, so they couldn't teach you properly because they didn't know properly. And the fifth of these supposed spiritual principles that are not true is definitely a bone of contention for many people, but the truth is the truth. And the number 5 is that you must tithe. That's simply not biblical. Not for New Testament believers. There is no command for New Testament believers to tithe. It just isn't there. Instead, what it does is it emphasizes the importance of generosity and love in giving, in that there are people today who give much more than the 10% that was mandated for tithes in the Old Testament. And the only reason why those tithes were mandated in the Old Testament were that the Levites were the only tribe among the Israelites that did not possess land, so they could not adequately care for themselves in terms of food provisions and things like that. So the Israelites were commanded to provide a tithe to support the Levite priests, because that was their job, was to be priests, and they had no material resources to speak of. They had no farms, they had no land. And if you read the texts of the Old Testament carefully, you'll realize that there was never any mention of a tithe in terms of money. The tithe was agricultural more so than anything else. It had to do with keeping the storehouses full so that provisions could be made for these Levite priests, and there would be food and grain in God's house. So those are the five. And again, there are people who might choose to debate those issues. But the bottom line is there is biblical basis for all of what I'm telling you, that these five supposed spiritual principles simply are not true. And we have to function as Christians from the perspective of truth in order to live our lives correctly and in order to teach or edify someone else. You have to know what the truth is before you can convey that to someone else. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, we'll do what we normally do. Stay humble, be genuine, and let Yeshua illuminate your path. You guys take care, and we'll see you again sometime in the month of August. Bye now.